Oh, hi. Welcome to Aquata Zoo, where we like to nerd out over all things zoo and aquarium related. I'm l.semple, and today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about risk management. I've talked about this in other contexts before, like when we're trying to deal with danger and crisis response and enrichment and training activities. There's always some risk involved when you're putting yourself in a position that's a little bit more vulnerable when it comes to wild animals. And we, as zookeepers and aquarium professionals, we do find ourselves at some points when we're trying to give good care to animals in very close proximity to animals that are not domesticated in any way, or, they're not pets, essentially. So I have talked about it in that type of context before. What I'm talking about this time is more of an organizational change kind of context, and how we, an organization is what I mean, we have to figure out where we are willing to make changes, where we need to make changes, and basically what's the worst that can happen, and how do we navigate that. I will likely do another episode on that topic, even though I've covered it a little bit before. I think I could probably do a little bit better job these days. I've got more education under my belt, so hopefully that will help. But anyway, part of change management is risk assessment. We have to figure out what we want to do, what the risks might be, how dangerous is this, what's the payoff? And we're tackling that as a group, as an organization, as a team, trying to figure out what's best for the future of the organization and how do we get there, what corners will we cut, which ones will we not. And risk management is a big part of this bigger discussion of how to execute change. So one part of the process of deciding if change is needed, or when it's needed, or how it's needed, is doing a risk assessment and doing some risk management. And so that's when we're kind of sitting down as a group and we're tossing ideas out there. We've probably got a change in mind, at least a vague idea about it, and you're kind of spitballing some ideas in how you're going to execute it. Or is this change really worth it? Is this payoff, this risk, this anything going to be worth it? Like, it's always hard to do change, and it takes time, it takes resources, it takes effort, and it takes support, honestly. So there are times when you want to do a change and you're just not sure how to get it done, and you're not sure if the payoff's going to be worth it, right? So that's when you sit down and you're like, what's the worst that can happen? It's a really, really important question for a lot of what we do as organizations and as zoos and aquariums. What is the worst that could happen? When we ask that when it's involving animals, there's a lot of worse things that could happen, right? Somebody could get hurt, an animal could die, a person could die. Like, those are the worst case scenarios, right? So as an organization, it's usually less life and death, but you're still talking about the health and well-being of your team, the health and well-being of your organization. Will we persist into the future? Sometimes when you're kind of pondering change and you ask yourself, what's the worst that could happen? Sometimes the worst is not changing, which means that you have kind of answered your question, whether this change is needed or not. You have already figured out that if you don't make a change that is really important for your industry or for your organization, for society's changes that have happened, right? That sort of thing. If you don't kind of move along with those changes, then your organization might fail. And so then, change is needed. Another very important question is one that we need to ask ourselves when we're kind of in this big think tank of ideas and thoughts and pondering the future of ourselves, our organization, and what it's going to look like, we need to ask ourselves, what's the best that could happen? So we've already asked ourselves the worst, because that's kind of intuitive, but we also sometimes forget to ask ourselves, what is the best thing that could happen? And that's a very different question. And that's when people move from that doom and gloom a little bit. They don't want the worst thing to happen and they're trying to avoid it. but what are we trying to navigate towards? So that's like the good part of change. As much as change can be scary and as negative an outlook that somebody could have for change, there's also this other side of it that is kind of exciting. What's the best that could happen, And that's more fun to consider and kind of easier to wrap your head around. Like, how do we get there? We're not just trying to avoid the bad stuff, we're also working towards our vision of the good stuff, right? So that is really helpful. And those are two really important questions when you're kind of considering your risk management situation. So those two questions help to put things into perspective, right? So you're trying to figure out, where do we go from here? And now how do we get there if we have decided that change is necessary? How do we navigate this? What changes do we make, like smaller changes, incremental changes, do we make in an effort to get to that pinnacle point that we want to be, right? To see that beautiful vision that we have in the future. So we've basically done a small gap assessment, which is basically trying to figure out, where are we right now and where do we want to be? And then that section in between those two states is our gap. And we're trying to figure out, how do we get from where we are now to the state where we want to be in the future? And what do those steps look like? How do we incrementally start moving towards that ideal situation? So that's where the risk assessments are also coming in, because there are changes you might want to make. Something might have high impact and get you a full step closer to that ideal that you want, but the risk is too high. And in this case, I'm talking about like risk with your customers, risk with your employees, risk with your stakeholders, whatever we're talking about. Like, if you make a change too big, too fast, without having explained what's going on or without giving enough information, you may get a lot of resistance. You may have people who don't understand what the vision is and where you're trying to head and why you're making this big drastic change. You might lose customers, right? And that impacts your bottom line. That is a big risk. What's the best that could happen? They could come right along with you, and that'd be great. But you have to now kind of figure out, when you're considering your next step, how exactly are you going to do it? And how are you going to plan it out so that you're sort of trying to minimize the bad risks and maximize the good risks? If that makes sense. This is all part of risk management. Good times. And to be fair, you can do this at just about any level. It kind of depends on the amount of influence that you have and what kind of changes you're trying to make. So I'm going to go back in my time machine and tell you about a time when I was trying to convince the people above me, my managers, that training for animals was a worthy time sink. Now, I didn't go through and think about it in all of these different ways because I didn't have the education about that and I didn't have the language for it. So I was just doing the best I could. So basically, I wanted to start training animals, A, because it's cool, B, because I thought it would benefit the animals, right? And so there was a lot of discussion that happened based on, zoos do this. Aquariums don't do it as much with fish. They do it with marine mammals for sure. So I guess quick history lesson. If you're interested in animal training and stuff, it kind of started with marine mammals, dolphins and such, because they're very smart. They could use that stimulation. They are able to do a lot of different things and remember things for a long time. So they were like an ideal animal to start this project with, like start animal training, right? So went from marine mammals to zoos and, other mammals generally. And so a lot of facilities, zoos and aquariums are incorporating training into their animal care, right? They'll get animals to step up on a scale. They'll get them to press their bodies against, a fence so that they can receive injections and like participate in their own health care and their own health management kind of stuff, right? And so when I first entered the field, it was kind of being toyed with for fish, but not really popular because fish and reptiles generally don't have as great of a memory So it's just kind of a little bit more challenging to train them. You have to be very patient. And I really was interested in it, and I thought it would benefit our animals quite a bit if we could get them to participate in their own healthcare, right? So I tried to sell that to my superiors in my facilities, and so they were kind of, I'm not really sure. So to them, looking back on it now, I could see what was going on. I'm this bright-eyed, bushy-tailed Aquarius coming to them saying I want to train all the animals, including fish, who are not known for their smarts and not known for their memory. But I wanted to give it a shot and see if I could make some of these procedures that we were doing by basically restraining animals a little bit better and a little bit less stress, a little bit, I don't know, just less dangerous for everybody involved, animals and people. And so that was my goal. And that's how I ended up selling it, because I was like, just first of all, give me a chance. I think that we can minimize the stress on the animals and get them to participate in their own health care, which is safer for them and it's safer for the staff. And so I was basically trying to sell it based on the risk assessment, So I'm saying, hey, what we have going on right now is that some of these like animal physicals can be a little bit dangerous. We're dealing with large animals that are very strong, and we're trying to get certain, morphometrics. We're trying to get measurements and weights and all these things. The animals don't understand what's going on, and it's scary for them. And so when they're stressed out and the people around them are stressed out because they're not sure how this is going to work, what is the animal going to do when we put them on the scale, all this kind of stuff. Like, it's a high stress environment for both the staff and the animals. So that was the current state at that moment. And what I wanted to do was try to reduce the stress. So training an animal to, for instance, come into a basket or a stretcher or something like that, so that this is not a scary thing. We're asking you to do something that we've already kind of been working on. We've been training for this, training for injections, so that if we do have to do some sort of injectable medicine, that they are trained so that that's not a scary thing. It's still uncomfortable, sure, but it's not nearly as bad as going into, in our case, water, getting the animal, holding them still, and trying to get them to accept this injection without any prior work, right? Like, sure, yeah, you can, I guess, force it, but you're putting the animal at risk for hurting themselves. You're putting the staff at risk for the animal hurting them because they're scared. And it's just a very scary, unpredictable environment. So what I was selling them was this possibly better situation. And I'm not saying that I am spearheading this or anything. It's just at the facilities where I was working, the training was not a high priority, and I was interested in making it a higher priority. This kind of work was happening all across the country, all across the world. I'm not claiming any sort of responsibility for being some kind of miracle worker here. I'm not. So at the facilities where I was working, training was not a high priority, but I kind of sold it as, hey, this is a risk that's worth it, right? Yes, I'm trying to work with animals a little bit closer, a little bit more often, which puts me in a dangerous position, kind of, as the animal trainer, because the animals are unpredictable sometimes, and I could be injured. It's unlikely that the animals would be injured, but there's always a possibility. Never say never. So, I was trying to sell this idea of turning this high stress, unpredictable environment where we're trying to do the best by the animals and get all of the information that we need to take good care of them into a lesser stress situation where it was less likely for people to get hurt or animals to get hurt, and we're still getting the information that we need to take good care of them. That's basically what it boils down to. I'm sure I worded that less cohesively in my youth because I didn't know what I was talking about, but I was just trying to get some momentum going for this change that I felt was needed. And so what really sold them on it, because, they noodled over that risk assessment, that risk management, those risk questions quite a lot. I answered them as much as I could, even though I didn't really know at the time that that's what I was doing. But I asked them to let me try. Just give me a shot. Let me try. Let's see if it makes a difference. And that's a much easier pill to swallow, I guess, than the full-on, I need your full approval, we need resources, we need time. I basically pitched it as I'm willing to put in my resources, my time into this if you will let me and if you're okay with it, because I'm not going to, mess with animals if it's not okay with my facility, obviously. So that was the way that I framed it, and we made some really good change. For the record, not that it really matters, but the training sessions went well. Animals were doing great, and they were doing things that we never had dreamt that they would do to help us help them, basically. It made, moving animals a lot easier. It made taking care of their health so much easier. We were able to keep closer tabs on them and, actually get our hands and eyeballs on them in much closer proximity. Like it was a good change, and now it's the norm for those facilities. I'm not saying that I did that. I did not. It was a group effort. And I'm just trying to illustrate here what was going on as far as the risks and the risk assessment and the need for change was concerned. This was a big change. Like this was kind of re-evaluating how we approached animal care, which for a zoo or aquarium is the core of what they do on the animal care side, right? If you're asking the animal care managers to reconsider the way they have been doing things for decades, that's challenging. It's very challenging. So I did meet a fair amount of resistance in the beginning, but ultimately our goal was to take the best care of animals that we could. They could see at least the logic in what I was saying, even if I didn't say it very eloquently. And they understood that it was not going to hurt or the risk was low if I just gave it a shot and they could see what the results would be. And that's how we went about it. I did a little bit of training here and there. The highest risk animals, honestly, the ones that could do the most damage to themselves or to the staff during physicals, were the ones that we started with. And they showed massive improvement, and we were able to get our work done so much faster. It was not nearly such a fiasco. And the animals were generally less stressed. So it was like a win-win for everyone involved. And so since we had some success there, I was allowed to continue and do more. All of our team was allowed to continue and do more. And so in the end, you end up with very nicely trained animals that can do all sorts of things and help us take care of them, which is great. It's low stress for them, it's low stress for us, and the risk assessment was key in making that happen. So on an organizational level, we do need to ask ourselves what the risks are, what's the best that could happen, what's the worst that could happen, and just kind of figure out how we're getting from point A to point B while minimizing the bad risk and maximizing the potential good payoffs for it, right? That's what we're trying to do. So as far as like an organizational level thing, I'm obviously familiar with animal care stuff, so I'll just say that social media has changed the way that guests interact with zoos and aquariums, right? And it has changed the opinion of how animal care works. And so I will say that in my time in this industry, about 20 years, that things are a lot different now. The views are a lot different now than they were when I started. And I think it's for the better. Like, people are more interested in hearing the behind the scenes tales of what's happening, and they have direct access, right? Social media has changed that. Now, so if I were in a facility that did not embrace the social media shifts that happen and try to take advantage of social media, that institution would fall behind, I guess, and people would be questioning their transparency and their animal care. And so it's really important to navigate that challenge carefully. There are high risks, there are high rewards, right? So an example that I came from a facility where I was, our director came and took a photo of some diamondback terrapins, which are a cute, cute little turtle. And they did this every time you would come over to their enclosure. They would just all pile on top of each other because you might have a snack. And so they'd be pushing each other out of the way, and they'd be sitting on top of each other, and they were very cute. And she came through, took a photo of them, posted it as part of the facility's social media, And people had a field day yelling at us about that photo. And it was just because there were lots of little turtle faces all in one very small area. They had plenty of room. You couldn't see the rest of the enclosure that they were in and how big it was and how much room they had to swim and crawl out and sun themselves and all this other stuff. All you could see were like 4 little faces all crammed into a tight photo. And yes, it was cute, but people were under the impression then that these animals did not have enough room and we were being cruel by smushing them together like that. And so that it was a good lesson for us because that showed that, oh, we need to be very clear about what's happening here. We can't just put up a cute picture and then hope that people understand the context of it. That is not what happens. So that changed how we approached our social media at the time. A facility that has embraced social media and done their risk assessments and decided that it was worth the risk is Cincinnati Zoo with Fiona the hippo. I don't know if you remember her from several years ago, but she was a premature birth and she was teeny tiny for a hippo. And even though the facility and the animal care team and the veterinary teams all knew that this was very touch and go and that this was possibly not a situation where things would turn out well, they still kept posting it on social media, giving daily updates, giving hourly updates as needed, and keeping people up to date on what was going on with this tiny challenged hippo. And people fell in love with her. They loved getting the updates. They loved seeing her cute little face, and they loved following along with her health journey as she started growing and was being cared for around the clock by these really, really devoted keepers and veterinary teams, right? So that was a decision that was made. What was the worst that could happen is that an animal died and then people were really sad about it. But what the best that could happen was it painted this zoo in wonderful light and got exposure about this really cool animal, and lots of people would be educated about how they grow, what they're doing, what kind of stimulation they need, how they grow up, and all this other beautiful information that people may not have noticed otherwise. And so that is an example of a change that was needed where facilities used to be pretty hush-hush about what was going on, especially when it came to delicate situations where animals might die. Then they took that and decided, let's be open and transparent about this. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens because it could be really good. And it turns out it was very good. Fiona is like my favorite hippo ever, and she's so cute. Even if she's ginormous now, she'll still always be that cute little Fiona to me. And so it was a great decision, a very risky decision, but one that kind of illustrates they saw what the best that could happen was, and they went for it. And like I said, this was at a time when the norm was kind of being quiet about things like this, situations like this, where an animal could die any second, right? In a facility where I used to work, we would pick up the stragglers in a sea turtle nest, right? And they're really delicate in those first couple weeks before they really start eating and stuff and learning how to dive and all this other kind of stuff. It's just like they're very, very delicate. That's why sea turtles have like hundreds of hatchlings at a time. They are on their own, but they are very delicate. So some of them have to survive, right? It's not going to be all of them. So we would get the stragglers, and they were already at a disadvantage, but we were trying to, get them through this really tough time. And so we were not allowing our PR team, our social media, we were not introducing these animals until we felt that they were pretty stable and they were going to stick around, right? It was not something that we liked to advertise, that an animal may be introduced and then may die. It is kind of the circle of life. Like, that's the reason that this was probably a straggler. They might not have been the most healthy animal ever, and it was destined to not live, right? But at the time, it was the norm when you have delicate animals like this that you would kind of keep it quiet so that you would basically avoid the backlash if you introduced an animal too soon and then it died of whatever natural causes, right? So that was an issue at the time, but like I said, this institution decided to handle that completely differently and be 100% open and transparent about it. And they took a risk and it worked out. It's not always going to work out, but that's why you have these discussions. And it's not a one person's kind of decision. This is a group decision where we're kind of evaluating what's going on, where we are currently, where we want to be, and how we get there. And if the risk is worth it. How do we minimize those bad risks? How do we emphasize the good risks? And, the whole time in Fiona and Cincinnati Zoo's example, they were very open about what was happening, including warning people that this animal might die tonight, right? Like, if this animal makes it through the night, that's going to be amazing, and we'll just take it day by day. And, they were very open about the fact that they could lose that animal anytime. And so they just looked at those risks and said that what could happen that would be good was worth it, and they needed to go for it. And I'm so glad that they did. Because that just made it okay for the rest of us to be a little bit more open about our animals. I'm not one to be secretive about what's happening. I like to be open and honest about it, but, some risk-averse facilities may not feel that way. So it's always good to have these group discussions so you can understand, what are we thinking as a group? What are we thinking as an organization? Is it worth the risk of, for example, an animal dying in order to potentially provide a lot of good information and a lot of exposure to this animal and make her famous, or show how good of animal care we provide and see how good our vets are and showcase all these people that are working so hard around the clock to make sure this animal lives. Like, they were looking at these things, and sure, it could have been partially, oops, happy accident. They fell into having this awesome hippo that did really well after a lot of work from a lot of people, but they did it. It worked out. It was a good risk. They tried to minimize what they could by getting out ahead of it and saying, listen, this animal might perish overnight. We're just playing it by ear. We'll see how she looks in the morning. Like, they were trying to get out in front of it and bringing people along on this journey. And so people loved it and were so invested. Fortunately, it worked out well. It's not always going to work out well, but the institution had likely discussed, do we do this? What's the worst that's going to happen? Are we ready to deal with that? Is that okay? And they decided that they were okay with it because they went through with it. And it's a big challenge. But when you're considering making a big change in how you handle stuff, there's got to be a discussion there about risk management and how we're going to deal with it. How are we going to minimize the bad risks? How are we going to maximize the good stuff? And what can we do as like a contingency plan? What's plan B? What's plan C? And just having an idea of what the future looks like. If this thing happens, then we're going to go this route. If that thing happens, then we'll go over here, right? Just talking through and having a strategic plan for what you want to do, given all these situations that might pan out. You can't plan for everything, of course, but having a vague idea and being able to reference your contingency plans just makes it easier. It makes people more comfortable with the risk that you're taking. And so that, in a nutshell, is more or less how we kind of deal with risk management as an organization or as a team, as opposed to risk management in the sense of animal enrichment or animal training or crisis management, that kind of thing. Yes, we want everybody to be safe. We want all of our animals to live and be in good shape. We want our organization to thrive. Societal changes can affect us. We just have to figure out how we make the good changes that we need to survive for the future as an organization or as individuals, and then manage the risk that's involved, because there's always something. Have your plan B, have your plan C. Minimize that rough risk that could take you down and maximize the one that could really pay off in the end. And that is basically how it's done. If you have any questions about that or any other leadership or management things or zoo and aquarium stuff, just write it up in an email. You can find me at aquatazoo@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the show, and I hope that you do, don't forget you can follow or subscribe on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get all of that sweet, sweet content as soon as it releases. If you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can find me at patreon.com/aquatazoo. And if you're looking to take a vacation and you don't know where to start, let me know. I happen to be a personal vacation advisor with Magical Vacation Planner, and I would love to help you out. It does not cost you anything extra. The links are in the show notes. Okay. Thanks for listening. I heart your faces. Okay, bye.